Well, I'm joined now by Ernesto Araujo, former Foreign Affairs Minister under the previous President Jair Bolsonaro, joining us from Connecticut in the USA. Mr. Araujo, thank you very much indeed for being there. When you were in office, you were not a fan of environmental concerns. Have you had a change of heart?
No, it's not that I wasn't a fan of environmental concerns. The problem is environmental discourse can be a cover-up for organized crime, for corruption, and other ills that we must combat. So what we tried to do, myself, the rest of the team under President Bolsonaro, was to fight the real problems in the Amazon and elsewhere, and not to just have a discourse that sounds good for the green community and let that sort of discourse be an excuse to keep going with the practices of corruption, be it national, be it local corruption, or turning a blind eye to organized crime.
So, well, OK, we'll come on to organised crime in a moment, but let's get the basics right. You blogged at the time that man-made climate change was untrue. Have you changed your mind about that?
Well, there's strong lack of evidence for the theory of anthropogenic global warming. You have lots of scientists that unfortunately are persecuted, are deplatformed, that argue that we don't have a climate crisis and that whatever climate change we have in the present is not mainly a consequence of human activity. So what I'm for is for a clean scientific debate. And I do think that the Paris Agreement and other aspects of international climate negotiations are an instrument for power grab for certain governments, for certain regimes, for certain international groups that basically want power and are not concerned with the planet. The planet is an excuse also for this sort of power grab.
Well, it's an interesting perspective. Let me highlight one of the stories we're coming on into our programme, and it concerns the Antarctica. Scientists down there have said, as never before, the sea ice is melting. Now, as I'm sure you'll know, Antarctica is one great big white reflector. If that reflective power is diminished, the globe warms up. Sea levels will rise, probably about by as much as a metre. Are you going to be happy to explain that to the people who live on lands which will easily be covered by the sea?
Well, there's lots of forecasts for what's going to happen with the temperature, with the sea levels that have not come to pass. Since the 1970s or 1980s, all sorts of forecasts have been made.
Sea levels have risen by half a metre, so we know that, don't we?
Depends on where. No, depends on where. The data is not so clear. Depends on where. Depends on what region you're talking about. It's not a worldwide phenomenon. Also, how can people know if this was not the situation in the Antarctica, for example, was not similar or even warmer 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, and people didn't know that Antarctica existed. So there's lots of also short-term perspective in that. People use the data of the last 40 years, which is the reliable data, and project that into the past and say, oh, this is unprecedented. But the evidence that we do have, although it's not precise because it comes from other sources, they point to the fact that you have had warmer periods in the past.
Let me ask you about another factor which I don't think you're in agreement with many of the environmentalists, and that is the consumption, particularly of meat and red meat, therefore the increased numbers of beef cattle, which have their own challenges for the environment as well. They would argue, as people no doubt at this conference are arguing, we should downsize the beef industry on a global basis. We need to get used to eating other products. Do you have any insight on that?
Yes, that's nonsense. That's, I don't know what kind of agenda that is, but people need protein. Cattle growing is the best source of protein for people. And it's definitely not harming the environment. The methane produced by cattle growing is a tiny amount of the gas is considered as greenhouse gases. So it's negligible, whatever effect that can have But the narrative that sort of power grab scheme controls wants to ban red meat. This is going to be a disaster for the health of people. It's going to make no difference at all for the atmosphere.
The meeting that is taking place today, the first one in some 14 years, does seem to be predicated on the idea we need to stop the deforestation of the Amazon. We need to protect the Amazon. It is the lungs of the world, they say. That was not the case when you were in power. Are you saying that all these delegates down in the Amazon basin are wasting their time?
Well, you have the problem of the narrative. Today, the world is governed not by ideas, but by narratives, right? So the narrative that the Bolsonaro government was against the environment or didn't care for the environment is simply not true. Right? What we had was a different approach to curbing deforestation and to fighting deforestation and other kinds of environmental crime in the region. Basically, we wanted to create private investment conditions for private investment in the Amazon to create sustainable jobs for the people. We have 30 million people living in the Brazilian Amazon and tens of millions in the other countries in the region. But as for Brazil, those people don't have decent ways of making a living. So they tend to be attracted by environmental crime or by organized crime as a whole. So we don't need NGOs to get money from whoever knows where and to spend it. How do you know how they spend their money? You need concrete investment projects. We had some ideas in that regard. We made an agreement with the Inter-American Development Bank to create a line for private investment in the Amazon, among other initiatives. And I have been, and I still am in close contact with people from the Amazon region, people who live there and work there, and what they think they need for the conservation of the forest is not discourse, is jobs, the creation of economic opportunity.
Ernesto Araujo, thank you very much indeed for being part of our program.